It is a special night. We're doing this cool thing of inviting a few of the guests who are experts on the newest episode of Reconnect America. So this is a special Hive call, and we're celebrating the long-awaited episode 3. We've been threatening to issue episode 3 for, I swear, 4 or 5 months. And what we ended up naming it was Amtrak's Genesis and the Ongoing Struggle to Reclaim the Public Purpose of Passenger Rail. I tell you, we wrote and rewrote this episode. Sasha worked so hard editing pieces together. We had dozens of interviews and not short pieces, lots of content. But we're really dedicated to telling a story that people can understand and that lasts the test of time. When we got to a particular place, we thought we were close to issuing it, and we said, you know what? We're not really addressing the fact that the creation of Amtrak is intimately connected to the creation of Conrail. And these sorts of things, we wanted to be really careful because we wanted to really connect the dots on what the creation of Amtrak meant, how it flowed out of the 100 years of history prior to that. We feel like the 2 episodes, episode 2 from the Reconnect America and episode 3, are very complimentary 2-part series on the history of passenger rail, and it's the public purpose and the tension between the public purpose and the private purpose, private profit. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome everybody tonight, and especially our guest, John Robert Smith, Chair of Transportation for America, and the former Amtrak Board Chair, Meredith Richards, National Chair for the Rail Passengers Association, and Tom White, co-founder of Climate Rail Alliance and veteran rail planner and author with nearly 60 years experience in the industry. So these are 3 voices, 3 people, 3 leaders who really shaped our recent episodes and who are shaping our thinking about rail and the public interest. I'm going to make sure that each of them get a chance to both talk about what they do in general to start with, and then we'll go over some of the updates on what they see happening in rail today, and then we will hopefully circle back to where do we go from here. With that, I wonder if I could ask each of you to introduce yourself. Let's start with you. Meredith Richards, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am Meredith Richards. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, a former elected official in Charlottesville, which is actually when I started my adult lifelong advocacy for passenger rail, because there was a lot of demand for more rail service than what we had at the time. Amtrak, having the history that you referred to and the formation of Amtrak, had basically wiped out most of what we had historically in Charlottesville. And I often heard how people really missed the trains that served our community. We had the Crescent and the 3-day Cardinal left. But that's sort of ancient history now. I am chair of the Rail Passengers Association, which is the nation's oldest 58 years old this year, passenger rail advocacy organization. It was formed about the same time Amtrak was formed, and the 2 are connected. We had a lot to do with the formation of Amtrak. What do I do as chair? I basically lead the board of directors, and we also have in the Rail Passengers Association a council of state representatives, and that extends to just about every state in the country, where we have a representative body of advocates that work with us, and we coordinate with their local activities and they coordinate with our federal activities. We get together twice a year for meetings in which we plan our policies and our legislative strategies for the next 6 months. These are really a key to our advocacy because they also work with our council members do, and our general members work with many organizations that represent statewide, regional, and local advocacy groups. They're working on their legislative issues and advocating for new routes and services throughout the country. It's a broad nationwide coalition. And because of that, I do a lot of traveling and I talk to a lot of advocates and advocacy groups. Because I'm from Virginia, often the interest falls on how we have achieved what we have in Virginia. And I'm able to share our experience and some of the key aspects that I think other states need to put into place in order to succeed also in their statewide passenger rail.
Mr. John Robert Smith, I'd like to say hi to these folks.
Good evening, everyone. And Bill, thank you for having me on tonight. I am chair of Transportation for America, senior policy advisor to Transportation for America and Smart Growth America. We're a national not-for-profit, and our work is at the intersection of transportation infrastructure, land use development, and economic development of cities large and small. I do a lot of work on Capitol Hill. I was on the Hill all day today on freight rail issues, but every office I visited wanted to be reassured that we're actually starting passenger rail service between New Orleans and Mobile this summer, which we are. It'll be the first such service started in many decades, certainly in the South. I served as a local elected official for 20 years, and I really began work on passenger rail when I was elected to the city council in 1989. We had a dead and dying downtown, and I desperately needed to bring people back into the living space of the downtown to create a sense of place that would identify us and be a place that others would want to visit and stay and perhaps raise their families. Looking at our strength in the past, which was our transportation connectivity and the fact that we were generated by two freight railroads that crossed and needed a city to emerge in the 1850s, we sought to become the South's first, and we didn't even know the name of it at the time, but it was an intermodal facility for passenger rail, bus, intercity bus, local transit, walkable, bikeable, all in the downtown, and began that work in 1993 when I was elected mayor, and then served 16 years as mayor. It's a strong mayor form of government. From the Whistle Stop tour of 1997, it was from May to December. 37 states were visited, 97 cities, 11,000 miles. And it was the Amtrak president, Tom Downs at the time, and his executive staff that had learned a tough lesson. They had, midway through building the South's first multimodal center, which you see behind me on my screen, Amtrak cut service south of Atlanta. Well, there went one of my big modes of transportation. So in organizing the mayors from New Orleans to Atlanta and going to Capitol Hill to push our delegations to restore that service, Trent Lott was junior senator from Mississippi. And he called Tom Downs, and if Trent were on tonight, and you should have him sometime, Bill, he's still very much engaged in passenger rail, still believes it. Trent would tell you he called Tom Downs and said, Tom, I didn't know I cared about Amtrak, but apparently I do. What do we need to do to get this service started back? So from that, Amtrak realized they had over 490 Amtrak mayors that were not being leveraged to be advocates for the support of passenger rail. And there was a large banner put up at Amtrak headquarters, which was at Union Station at the time, that said, "It's Meridian, stupid," meaning it's small town America that's going to save passenger rail.
Yeah.
So they launched this Whistle Stop tour to visit those 97 cities and hear the different stories, because passenger rail means something different in each one of those places. It means something to those people. It defines their character. Most importantly, it defines what they see as a future of being connected to the rest of the nation. So that's why I'm wearing this. Meridian was one of those stops. And of course, we opened this facility. And from that, I was appointed to the Amtrak Board of Directors. and was ultimately elected chairman of the board when Tommy Thompson, who had been the chair, went to become Secretary of Health and Human Services. So that's how I got into this conversation. So over 30 years, I've still been in the conversation. And like I said, was on the Hill today doing that same work. So thank all of you for your interest in passenger rail and your understanding of what it means to the American people. And Bill, when I was on the board of directors, the people who worked for Amtrak and the board members were committed to a mission of providing passenger rail to serve large metropolitan areas, but important small city centers as well, and all of the people who lived in those places, to connect them to their families, to opportunities, and to a more vibrant economy. They rode the train. When I was on the board, if you travel for Amtrak, you took a train to where you were traveling to. So it forced everyone at Amtrak to use the system that they were working for, and to not only use it, but to listen to the passengers on board who are their customers, and pay attention to those who fund it, who are the American people.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll circle back towards this theme and taking a little deeper look at what is Amtrak and how is it doing in a minute. But first, I'd like to invite Tom White to introduce himself.
I've been in the railroad industry for coming up on 60 years. I've got 28 years in the Class 1 and Class 1 terminal railroad world. Started in Chicago. I've been a interlocking operator, a telegrapher, a yard clerk, a crew clerk, but mostly a train dispatcher for over 20 years. I started when there was no such thing as a freight railroad, and I was also doing that before they knew you couldn't mix freight and passenger trains. So the place that I started had 14 round-trip passenger trains a day between Chicago and Kansas City, plus about 30 freight trains. And everything was on time. There was, like, you never had to ask the dispatcher, is this train going to be on time? He would call you if it wasn't. Wasn't was the exception. So I did that in Chicago, moved to Bakersfield, California, was a train dispatcher there handling between Los Angeles and Sacramento. And by that time, there were freight railroads, and that was one of them. So I had no passenger trains. Worked a little bit in the East Bay and Oakland and Berkeley in a terminal railroad, came up here to the Northwest, went to work for the Milwaukee Railroad, which not only was a freight railroad, it was just barely a railroad. Stayed with that until I could see that the ship was sinking. Took some time off to do non-railroad stuff after being totally disgusted by the Milwaukee. When I ran out of money, I went to work for Burlington Northern, got hired as a telegraph operator, train dispatcher. Then for the last 6 years, I was assigned to service design, capacity design, operations planning, timetabling. During that time, I developed the Sounder commuter train service from Seattle from scratch. It seems that the chairman, Jerry Grinstein, was from Seattle. And one of the questions he had when he became CEO of Burlington Northern was, why does one end of my railroad have the world-class commuter trains and the other ones got none? Make it happen. So I was assigned to make it happen. I was one of the principal people behind creating the Amtrak Cascade service, and also worked on commuter rail in what is now DART in Fort Worth, Dallas, a little bit on the West Coast Express in Vancouver, BC, some trial projects that we proved wouldn't work out in Kansas City and St. Louis. A bunch of other freight service organizing. And then in 1997, they said, now, if y'all want to keep on working, y'all are going to work in Fort Worth, Texas. So I thought about the difference between Seattle and Fort Worth for almost a half a nanosecond and became a consultant. There, I've developed a brand new commuter rail system in Mexico City, overhauled the one in Durban, South Africa, and the one in Joburg, South Africa. Worked on commuter rail projects in North Carolina and in Boston and a couple of others. I did some work on Amtrak projects, including some work where BNSF said, well, we need for Amtrak to pay more because they are harder on our curves and freight trains. And they hired me to prove it. And what I proved was that that wasn't the case. After South Africa, the past decade mostly, my work has been pro bono advocacy like you guys, working mostly in Washington, but also on some passenger projects in the LA basin, and haven't left the freight world behind. Bill and I are working on an alternative to barges on the Snake River. So basically, he came up with a concept, and I've designed a brand new railroad for easing the Class 1 railroad monopoly out of the picture, let's say. And here I am.
Yeah, we'll be selling stock here, going public very shortly. All right. So everybody, I've brought together three people who can teach us a great deal. And because we've done our best to document a lot of the history, we're not going to spend today talking about sort of the history of Amtrak so much as we're going to talk about the present and going forward. So if people might be wondering where Sasha is the young co-producer of Reconnect America and works on Solutionary Rail. Sasha is hanging out in France, and he thought, wow, I got episode 3 done. Now I can jet. So we thought that was fair. Sasha, we miss you. All right. I'd like to hear from each of you, and I'm sure a lot of us have this on our mind. In the last few months, we've listened to people talk about privatizing Amtrak and budget cuts, decisions to cut staff. And I think that I'd like to get first, let's take on this privatization idea. Can I get each of you to react to the possibility of privatizing Amtrak? And whoever wants to go can go first. I tend to let Ms. Meredith go first.
Yes, I was quite amused when Elon Musk proposed privatizing the U.S. Postal Service, which of course is established in the Constitution, and Amtrak, which is not, and cited the example of Chinese high-speed rail as the model of what he thought successful rail systems should be, that we should emulate in the United States. And what was amusing to me about that, sadly amusing in a way, was that, of course, those of us who know something about passenger rail in other countries would immediately recognize the fallacy in that, because China has invested billions of dollars as a public investment, as a government investment in developing its high-speed rail. Millions of people use it seamlessly every day. They operate it and they own it. So privatization has absolutely nothing to do with the success of the model that Elon Musk seems to think that we should be patterned after. There's really no evidence that publicly owned railroads, when they go private, succeed, as in terms of ridership or revenue or profitability. More than often, the experience is that the service declines and the cost of the service, as well as the fares, goes up. There's really not any historical precedent that we can cite that privatization works in any form of public transportation. And certainly we know that no other modality of transportation in the United States is privately owned or privately operated. The model is public ownership. And there are many people, including, I know, Solutionary Rail and our rail unions, who are putting on a pretty strong campaign in support of full public ownership and operating cost of passenger rail. Certainly the idea of strictly privatizing is a formula for failure of passenger rail.
One of the most interesting statistics that I discovered in the preparation of that most recent episode was looking at the statistics from the Interstate Commerce Commission, started in 1936, where they separated the profit, the income the revenue from freight and passenger aspects of their business. And going back to 1936, there were only 4 years where there was actually revenue positive numbers for their passenger service. And that was during World War II, during all the rationing. And we do bring that up. So it is quite interesting considering this, the rescuing of the railroads was rescuing it from a private operations that were to help these railroad companies shed a service that was not generating profit. So the idea of, yes, restoring it that way. But, you know, maybe to build on that, I'd like to ask John Robert Smith or Tom or anyone, if the Northeast Corridor that has so much traffic on it, if it were separated from the long distance services, would it be able to be profitable? But would it be able to sustain, repair, maintain, and improve its infrastructure that the trains run on? Could it take full ownership and be a profit-making venture for some entity?
Probably not. Let's look at the European example where they've been private and public and private and semi-private. So they have always considered railroads to be a military necessity. In fact, the reason that Russia and Spain both have a different track gauge from standard was to prevent Napoleon from running trains in there and conquering them. So with complete public ownership of the rail system, well, first with private ownership, same thing happened there that happened here during the Civil War. They needed troop movements, and the railroad companies said, well, yeah, it's cash, and we'll get to it when we get to it. So after enough of those incidents, they nationalized the railroads. Lincoln only threatened it, and that was enough to scare them for a while. They nationalized the railroads. And back in the 80s, the European Union had figured out that a monopoly owned by the government is no different than a monopoly owned by stockholders, which is why they came up with the concept that I promote, which is separating track from service, which is your above the rail cost. And in the process, requiring the entire network to be open access so that anybody who's a qualified train operator can reserve a slot or a schedule and run a train. So all of the European operators, and I believe even Chinese operators, which is actually a government-owned corporation like Amtrak, even the Chinese operators, they're only worried about above the rail. And then the system is set up so that the infrastructure manager charges basically the cost of owning and operating the infrastructure plus a percentage of profit, variable in different countries. That has worked well, and the commuter services and some of the regional services come under the heading of public service obligations. They can't make enough money for a private operator, so they're government financed, and they hire operators the same way that the LA commuter service does, Boston, so on. And then the long distance operators and even the high speed folks are supposed to pay their own way. They don't get subsidies. So it can work above the rail if you separate the costs, but there's no way that you're going to make enough revenue. And I'm going to qualify that in a second. Well, no, not necessarily. You can't make enough revenue to pay for the infrastructure, but then no other mode of transportation does.
Right.
Buses are subsidized, barges are subsidized, airplanes. So there's no mode that makes enough to pay for its infrastructure. Even air traffic, which has minimal infrastructure, can't pay for it. And they get a long-term benefit because of the fact that the airports are publicly owned and they get the finance on municipal bonds instead of borrowing money on the market. But then if we return to the privatization thing in the first place, the only people who think privatization is any good is the Ferengi. Everything must make a profit. But let's think about this. The government doesn't need to make a profit. Privatization requires a profit. So they are going to either have to skimp on service and infrastructure and such, or they're going to have to pay dirt cheap wages because they're going to see to it that they make their profit. Well, England misinterpreted the EU's requirements in the first place and said, oh my, we have to privatize everything. So they basically sold their infrastructure to a private corporation who promptly quit maintaining it so that they could make profit. And it turned into a wreck of a high-speed train. And then let's go just for a second into the high-speed trains and Elon Musk. The highest percentage in the world is China at 52%. And typically it's 10 to 15% of the passenger miles are on high-speed rail. No, high-speed rail came about when they couldn't improve the conventional railroads anymore, and they had to go to the next step. So there's a lot of conventional railroads that we can't even dream of right now before you're ready for the real high-speed rail.
I'd like to, before I asked John Robert Smith to build upon this, because I feel like I have a sense of a variety of trajectories that you can take us down. One question I want to just put out there in the world, and the question has come from doing this work recently, is I kind of wonder if any of the railroads if you had to figure out the actual cost of running and maintaining the infrastructure, if any freight or passenger is actually completely profitable, including the cost of the infrastructure. Like, I've just looking at the history, it seems like one bailout, one stock market crash, one intervention, chronic series of interventions. So I'm starting to wonder if anything is profitable except for above the rails. But
oh yeah, it is now.
Well,
don't forget, all those things happened under punitive regulation.
Right. Thank you. That's the qualifying piece. Is as long as the public purpose of I'm saying it can't be profitable if the public purpose is actually fully realized and served. So if all the farmers and all the towns and all the manufacturers and all the communities are getting the rail, the shipping, the service that they deserve and that they need to thrive, no, I'm starting to be quite skeptical. If the only way you can do it is through scarcity and manipulating monopolies, I have an inkling that might be where we're going. But John Robert Smith, we are not going to put Amtrak onto a pedestal as our golden calf, because I know that Amtrak wasn't the perfect solution to the problem we were solving. How do you weigh your critique of the way that Amtrak is managed and these other calls and your passionate commitment to seeing communities served by passenger rail? Is that a crazy question to put in front of you?
No, not at all. But let's do a little level setting
Cool.
to begin with. First of all, in picking up on what Tom said, there is no transportation system that carries human beings in the world that pays for its total cost of the fare box.
Right.
Not your personal automobile. When you back out of your driveway, you're on someone else's infrastructure.
Right.
So I haven't owned a car in 15 years. I live in a very transit-rich environment in Washington, D.C. now. But my income tax goes to pay and fill the hole in the fund to support our nation's highways. And I'm glad to do that. But we must acknowledge that when we drive, we're on infrastructure paid for by a nation. You look at aviation. It's not just the airports and the runways. It's the air traffic control system. It's the TSA agents. All of that is paid by your national government. A national government or federal government exists, any government exists, to provide for you that which you cannot provide for yourself. If it's a city, it's a police force, it's a fire department. For the nation, it's the common defense. The very first act of Congress, of the Continental Congress, was creation of postal roads because they knew that was what would bind these 13 colonies together, being able to communicate. And from that, of course, we can go through the history of passenger rail. But again, that's a choice at the national government to invest. We did that robustly in the highway system. We have not done that in the passenger rail system. So to answer your question some time ago, can the Northeast Corridor sustain itself, all included? No. Anyone who, if you sell off the Northeast Corridor, whomever buys it is still going to look for the national government to provide infrastructure dollars because they've got a 40 billion estimate of infrastructure needs right today. You look at the deterioration of the catenary through the Northeast Corridor, the trackage through the Northeast Corridor, now equipment failures. We haven't been able to get the new Acela equipment up and running. Lots of issues there. When you lose your sight of your mission, and when it becomes not about providing passenger rail service to a nation, but it becomes about your salary, your bonus. When you have bonuses that over the past 2 years will track in at 50 million a year or 100 million a year bonuses, your mind is focused on the wrong outcome. It becomes very personal. It's not about providing the service. So we've got to get back to a company that understands they exist not for a profit, but for a service. And yes, they're to be efficient in every possible way, but they're still judged by how they serve that customer who needs that transportation connectivity. We can't all be relegated just to the use of the personal automobile. I'll go to see offices and they'll say, well, my people don't ride a train. And I'll say, well, Congressman, your people don't have a train. They can't ride what they do not have. Well, my people want to drive a car, but that's the choice you gave them. They don't have another choice. So we're seeing more and more small towns, rural areas understand that they are dying because they're not connected to a larger economy by other modes of transportation. And the young workforce of today is demanding that. I tell mayors all the time, you tell your people when you're being elected, I'm going to create a hometown where our young people want to come home and start a family and build a career and a job. Well, if you mean that, you ought to ask them what they're looking for. And one of the things they're looking for is that connectivity to the larger region that's not solely predicated on the automobile, which is becoming more and more expensive to own. So the turn Amtrak needs to make is to get back to a board that takes their governance seriously, that asks very hard questions of the leadership that comes from the public service industry and the rail industry and not necessarily the aviation industry, and a Congress that will provide oversight, that will ask questions about, you paid $100 million in bonuses on top of salaries. What did we get for that? What was the customer experience? How much more robust is the system now than it was? How many more places are you connecting?
It wasn't connected to performance at all. It was just bonuses paid with no consequences and no standards that were required in terms
And
of.
they now have a bullseye.
Go ahead.
Bullseye, which they have painted on themselves.
Yes, and it has definitely come back.
Coming on them for them. And of course, the trick is going to be how to transform Amtrak and not totally destroy passenger rail. And I think there are very solid ways of doing that. We can talk about that more later.
There's two interesting points brought up there. First, the post roads. There was a Supreme Court decision in the 1850s that said that all railroads at the time and existing into the future would be considered post roads. So actually, there's a public service intended in the rail network that hasn't been unearthed and used. When it comes to efficiency, back in the days before there were freight railroads, when I was chief dispatcher, my job was to figure out the least expensive way to provide all of the service, not to cut stuff to make it less expensive. And that required a lot of knowledge about how things work, and it required innovation. And that all went away because I worked in the industry going from railroad to freight railroad, but also regulated railroad to deregulated railroad. And after 1980, the job just wasn't fun anymore because it was, well, we're not going to do this. We're not going to serve these customers. We're going to close down these places. That was never the case under regulation. The regulation screwed up because it was punitive. But the good part about regulation was it leveled the playing field for everything financial. Everybody couldn't make deals for financial advantage, so it had to be done on service. And the regulation required providing all of the service. All that went away with deregulation, which puts us in the deep fryer oil that we're in now.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting as we begin to move into creating the next episode and moving from the 1970s to 76, et cetera, to 1980 and the Staggers Act. We're also trying to weigh and understand who was asking for this. And I was interested to see some indication that there was reticence on the part of the class ones in terms of embracing the staggers and deregulation. But I want to get back to John Robert Smith's point that the sense of mission, the pressure to professionalize Amtrak, to make it act more like a corporation. And then if you ask something to act like a corporation, and then you get mad at it for acting like a corporation, then who's really to blame for that? And, so when we put a target on their back, they kind of perhaps they got set up, but now they got that target on the back. So what's our Aikido move to take the target off of the back and reorient the conversation to the community, to returning service to communities?
So as we look to expand passenger rail in the country, and IIJA was transformative in its vision, but unfortunately they couldn't get the money out the door. And you're ultimately measured in any form of government is what was the net result. I always view, at least my city, as a company. I was the president and CEO of the company. My council was the board of directors, but the stockholders, whether willing or not, were the people of the city of Meridian, Mississippi, and I owed them a return on investment. So what is that return on investment? And it should be in the quality of the service that's provided. Well, IIJA set up the opportunity for the development of additional corridors, passenger rail corridors. And I think there were some 69 awarded by FRA. And of course, we know that if 10 of those come into being, that will be a miraculous thing.
There were 69, yeah.
Yeah, I think some healthy competition in the provision of passenger rail would be a good thing. The thing that prevents others from getting into offering passenger rail, basically two things. One is the liability indemnification issue that Amtrak is.
Right. Yes.
The other is access to equipment, because right now, our tax dollars go to the federal government. They, with grants to Amtrak, purchase equipment for Amtrak, but it's owned by Amtrak. It's not accessible to any other provider that might want to use that service. They could lease it from Amtrak, but you can imagine how attractive would your lease to a competitor be? So I don't think that's realistic. So we're actually working on language right now that we would want to offer in the next authorization bill that would tackle the indemnification and liability issue
Oh.
so that if Tom wants to create a railroad or advise an existing short line or freight railroad to get into the passenger rail business, that railroad would be able to get the same kind of indemnification that Amtrak enjoys, and the federal government indemnifies entities acting on their behalf all the time. So it's a matter of finding, which we're working to do now, adapting existing language, because Congress likes to do something where there's a track record, adapting additional existing language that would allow others to enjoy that indemnification. The second thing is an equipment pool, a national equipment pool. And I would argue if everyone on this call, assuming you paid your taxes, that money goes to the federal government, and the ownership of the equipment belongs to the people of the United States who paid for it. And
Right.
therefore, that equipment should be a national pool of equipment, which Amtrak can lease or purchase, or another provider can lease or purchase. Yeah, if we can solve these two issues, it will go a long way to enticing others to compete for extensions of rail service, whether it's in the South or the Northwest or the Central Plains.
Ms. Meredith, what do you think about this? I just feel like what are you, how does this?
Well,
feel?
I completely concur. Rail passengers legislative blueprint for the reauthorization of the surface transportation reauthorization include those elements as well, particularly the leasing, the national equipment pool for leasing purposes, and with some fairly specific elements to it. You probably, knowing how you and Jim get along, you probably have some familiarity with what we're proposing. Possibly you're even in a working group with him, I don't know. But it can be found, the elements of that, with quite a few details worked out are proposed or are on our website. And I would encourage people to look at that whole blueprint. It is not just in terms of smoothing out procurement and regulations for construction and new projects and fleet improvements with leasing, but also other elements. For example, well, I can't go into all of it. There's just too much. It's probably 10 pages of possible legislation that we're hoping to promote, but one of them is the leasing. And I think it's an excellent proposal. So we're with you on that, and I hope we'll work together to get that one through Congress.
Well, and an offshoot of the national pool is right now U.S. rail cars, passenger service cars, are outlandishly expensive because they're all one-offs. If you travel on the conventional railroads in Europe, you'll look at their older equipment, and from country to country, it looks pretty similar. That's because actually the different countries' railroad companies got together and developed a common standard for passenger cars.
That's one other element to our list is standardization of equipment. And I know that the manufacturers would certainly appreciate that as well. We could get a lot more out the door more quickly and create a lot more jobs that way. Standardizing some infrastructure elements like signal and elements of what make for safe infrastructure to be standardized as well.
Tom is right. We have been developing boutique railroads and rail equipment. And what we really have to have a robust passenger rail system in this country, we need a supplier system to develop in this country. And they can't do it when you build a new rail line every 25 years. You have to have a continuing stream of orders, and we have to be able to get it right in this country. And perhaps we need to create a separate entity at the federal level that's charged with nothing else than standardizing, designing, and acquiring passenger rail equipment to constitute this pool, which can be used from line to line. It's not hybrid equipment. And we
Oh.
run into this with getting the new Acela equipment out that's been sitting there for 3.5 years. We designed boutique equipment to try to fit an infrastructure which is not nearly the same as the infrastructure that you find in Europe or Asia. So we need to develop a U.S. rail system based on orders coming
Yeah.
that can support a robust industry. But
Right.
the industry has to be producing a product that they can produce to scale. It can't be one-offs.
That's right.
Where's the connection then to the access to the rights of way so they can offer on-time performance for trains that people will ride?
Well, that is, in a way, more custom, actually, and needs to be more custom. One of the things the railroad industry likes to do is improvise. And then they go through this computer simulation where they determine what infrastructure to build. It doesn't work very well. It never has worked. I published a paper on the fact that that doesn't work. You really need to do the same method that I used for the Cascade service. First off, 110 mile an hour passenger trains and 37 ton per axle grain trains don't play well together on the same track. So I worked in the days when the axle loading was similar, freight and passenger, and there was no problem mixing them. At 79 or even 90 miles an hour, it's not a big problem. But you get to above 90 miles an hour, and you'd be maintaining the track after the freight train before the next passenger train. So the only way to do this is you design the infrastructure around the timetable. You have to first figure out what the service will be, and then plan the tracks for the service. So I've worked on North Star, the Cascades, the Sounder, a bunch of them. And then each one, the situation is unique. They could have used standardized locomotives and cars. And in a way, the commuter services kind of do. Everybody uses the Bombardier cars, except Metro and Chicago. And that part can all be standardized. But you actually have to design the railroad for the traffic. It's frowned upon here because this simulation and statistical analysis is easier to do, but it's not effective. So that part has to not be standardized. It has to be custom.
Well, and that's a place where,
Back-
Tom, you're super strong in, not that there isn't just, I can't even think of anything you're not strong in this subject area, but I just want to say that, you know, I was on a call earlier today with the TRB's Freight Rail Committee, and they had a presentation on setting standards, but they were talking about standards in engineering. And I asked, well, are there standards for and educational programs in dispatching, you know, in the planning process to try to get to the very question that you're asking? So in this process, like if we're going to make American rail great again, you know, is there a way to do that? What are the components? We have the component of a adequate carpool, which could be manufactured here in this country, could be with union labor. It could be, you know, prevailing wages, all of those rules. What about workforce development and training programs so that we have the knowledge base to actually do that customization of that route planning that you're talking about? I've seen your string charts, Tom, and I think it's very interesting to look at one that's well designed versus one that's a clusterfuck. You know, if the rolling stock, the equipment is one of the avenues, is workforce development design a part of this, y'all?
Absolutely.
How about for our national leaders, these two who are from these national organizations? Is there a workforce development aspect here?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. New York University did that study that demonstrated that the U.S. rail infrastructure is the most expensive in the world for a lack of expertise. Even in the public sector, you know, I'm a strong advocate in if you need to hire an expert, you need to know enough to know whether or not your expert is an expert. And the U.S. public sector doesn't do that. So the engineering companies, in the case of State Rail Service, the railroad companies just take them for a ride. They know they've got a patsy. So if you look at Michigan Tech in Houghton, Michigan, has a rail engineering program that basically is a bachelor's program in how to build stuff. So they teach them how to build railroad stuff, but not why to build it or how you use it. University of Illinois is really bizarre because of the fact that their rail program is a graduate program. So you take 4 years of civil engineering working on highways, and then you go into advanced topics in railroading. I worked with them on a bunch of stuff, and it has some really bizarre stuff come out of it. There's one other program in the country now. When probably 20 years ago, the EU and the U.S. Department of Education did a study on comparing U.S. and European higher education in railroads. And there's just no comparison. Just in Germany, there are 9 full degree railroad programs. I have friends who are PhDs in railroad operation, who actually had a career working on the railroad to do it. To show you how long they are at doing this, the Technical University in Dresden celebrated their 150th anniversary of the rail program. I was invited to be a guest speaker for that. 150 years they've been studying railroad operation, and we don't study it. I've considered actually starting my own program, but you have a problem of who's going to pay for a program when the industry doesn't want the expertise.
The FRA helped establish a program in Morgan State University just a few years ago, and they are partnering with the University of Delaware Rail program to develop the curriculum. The FRA actually put quite a lot of money into a new rail program. Historically Black university.
It is good. However, the U.S. railroad industry doesn't want anybody who they want people who know how to build stuff. They don't want people who know how to run it.
Well, I want to transition, Tom, pardon me, but I want to hear from John Robert Smith, who's just walking the halls of the Congress. Is there a place in this making America's railroads great again? Is there a place for us to be able to make these arguments for workforce development, investment in manufacturing and standardization, this pool, and returning service to communities? Is there a place at the national front for this, for all of these, do you think?
Absolutely. And, we were a large part of writing the language that's in IIJA for passenger rail. And that was led by Republican senators. Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi was the strongest proponent and author of most of that language. So you can articulate this certainly to Republicans because you're making it about building an industry and creating jobs. And one thing you hear is we're going to bring manufacturing back to this country. Well, this could bring manufacturing back in a very real way, and in a way that scales up to support a large passenger rail industry in the United States. It also serves, if you stay with the national system, it serves small towns in rural America, which was the largest base of vote for the president. So if you articulate it right, I think it's a very strong case to make for passenger rail governed properly and with proper oversight and with absolute focus on a clearly defined mission, which federally, whether it's the White House and Congress, I would submit, should be able to articulate that vision to Amtrak, and then board members are chosen by their demonstration of knowledge, expertise, and support of passenger rail over a body of work, so that selection of board members becomes a really serious appointment rather than a political supporter. So much of Amtrak has been focused solely on the Northeast corridor. Amtrak was created to save the national passenger rail system, those long-distance trains that were threatened. The Northeast Corridor was not a part of the deal to begin with. Oftentimes, the board has made decisions that are based solely on the Northeast Corridor to the expense of the long-distance system. And anyone who says, well, stop all those long-distance trains, that'll save a bunch of money. It doesn't save money at all. All of that back of house that's borne by the long-distance system is transferred over to state-supported trains in the Northeast Corridor, which becomes even less attractive financially with those back-of-house add-ons. You lose all the revenue, and you lose the connectivity that the long-distance trains bring to state-supported trains and to the Northeast Corridor as well. And keep in mind, during the height of COVID, long-distance trains carried more people and returned more revenue to Amtrak than the Northeast Corridor and the state-supported trains combined.
Wow. That's very interesting. Thank you.
There's a point that actually, when you talk about Congress, needs to pique their interest, and that is that the railroad industry insists that they will be destroyed by passenger trains. Experience from before there were freight railroads shows that's false. But B, passenger trains, in order to run them on time, require not only knowledge, but discipline. The freight railroads don't like discipline. They like to improvise. And I've got an example here in the Northwest where when we instituted the Cascades service to Vancouver, BC, all of the knowledgeable gurus insisted we were going to bankrupt the railroad. The customers would all go away. At the time, we were attempting to do European-style schedule operation. Again, Jerry Grinstein. And the local managers weren't paying any attention. So I had already timetabled the freight service between Seattle and Vancouver, BC. And they were using 2 crews, wearing out their 12 hours, 2 crews for a 100-mile trip every day, 10 trains a day. Our on-time performance was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. So on day 1, Jerry Grinstein had told all the middle managers, heads will roll if this train isn't on time. The government gave us $150 million to fix our railroads. Trains will be on time. That morning, the magic happened. The service went from 20% to 100% on time for freight trains, and the number of hours for service really went from 10 a day to 0 because it brought discipline. I had already written a timetable for them, and they weren't following it. I integrated the passenger timetable with the freight timetable. That required discipline to make it happen, and instantly they got to 100% performance for freight.
When the freight railroads believed that the law at the time, which was FRA and Amtrak, get to set what on-time performance means, and they set it at 85%. When the freights believed that was the law, the trains were running 80, 85% in that range. The morning that a judge overturned that and said, no, we've got to throw that out because Amtrak can't be at the table when you set the on-time performance, that day, the trains went from 85% on time in the morning to 40% by the end of the day. One of them, you can run them on time, as Tom said, when you have the discipline and the expectancy that freight on time is important. I had one of the largest freight carriers in the country that we were dealing with on the Gulf service tell me, if our train gets there the same week we say it'll be there, that's on time for us. I think Tom would agree that the string models, which Bill used a non-railroad term to describe bad string modeling, but it's only as good as the inputs you put into it. And if a freight company holds their modeling in a black box, they can put whatever they want to into it to get the outcome that they want. And we saw that happen with the Gulf service saying they would need $2.4 billion of infrastructure. And this nation went to Mars for $2.3 billion, and we're trying to get to Mobile.
I'm going to try to do a quick pivot. We don't have a great deal of time left. This normally would end at 6:15 in about 5 minutes. And if folks want to stay on a few more minutes, I appreciate that too. But I would like to pivot towards our next steps. And what's the role of states at this moment in terms of increasing and improving passenger rail service, public investment in rail? It seems like the concept of dedicated funding has been really important for you, Meredith, in Virginia. We know that the folks in Oregon were working on a bill this year to try to find a dedicated funding stream using a tax or a fee on tires. From your experience, Meredith, what do you think the role of the state organizing is in terms of elevating rail in the political dialogue?
Mhm. I think the state partnership with the federal government has been extremely important for sort of reviving ridership and constituency for passenger rail, particularly in some of these rural communities that John Robert talks about. We have in Virginia now small towns who have launched major public efforts to bring a new train, bring an existing train on an existing route to their community. They're willing to invest in building stations and acquiring property to do that. They're clamoring for the services. And these will be state-supported trains that are going to provide most of the service. But the state is acutely aware that people across the state are really pressing for new service, and they're willing to provide it if people are willing to pay for it. I think this is really what's driven new life into passenger rail in this country. The states have invested. They've started many new routes. They're corridor services. They're 750 miles or less, but they do connect. Usually they'll connect with the national network. So I actually think it's been a very good and smart move for the country. And the Corridor ID program will only increase the robustness of those services because more states will start to invest in them. I do think there need to be some federal incentives and maybe distribution of federal money to help the states that are not currently prepared to do that, to gear up to do it, to help them with planning and construction, and even possibly with some operation for the trains. That's been a problem in many states, is that the states are not ready, they're not prepared to do that. And I think with some federal incentives, they might be able to do it, because I do think the demand is there. When I go to Congress and I do what John Robert was talking about doing, and that is going to see particularly the Republican congressmen, they typically have got constituents in rural communities who either have and really are committed to their rail service or looking for new rail service for their communities. So they're acutely aware that they have people in their district who are demanding new service, who are very committed to their existing services. And they tend to be rural areas. You know, the urban areas have got, of course, their service is very important to them too, but they also often have other alternatives. So I do think that the state programs have been extremely important, and we need to help more states do them.
Mm-hmm. And this is another thing I just want to throw in there, the 750-mile threshold that some people may or may not know about, that the federal government doesn't take on, Amtrak won't take on the funding of any corridor that's under 750 miles, which then is a disincentive for the states, because how many states have 750 miles worth of distance in their routes? But so I'm wondering about, okay, what's the role of the federal government, what's the role of states, but what is the role of the states for the organizers and the local advocates?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually, at least as in my travels to work with advocacy groups, I'd say at least as many of them are organized around new corridor routes rather than new national routes. They might be part of an interstate coalition that's looking for a new national route or to be part of an existing route. But I'd say more of them are really advocating for the shorter routes to connect to one of the national routes.
Bill, the Southern Rail Commission is the oldest such commission in the country. It's over 40 years old. It was authorized by an act of Congress, but it was created by 3 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama.
Right.
It wouldn't be the top 3 states that would come to anyone's mind about investing in passenger rail, yet all 3 of those states have done so because of the press from local governments to their state government to invest in completing this service, which will be known as the Mardi Gras service, running from Mobile to New Orleans through 4 cities in Mississippi, based on the financial return to those communities. So we worked with the University of Southern Mississippi, the Trent Lott Institute, so it wouldn't be a liberal think tank, very conservative economic development entity, to study the economic impact of running that service. 2 round trips a day, every station gets 4 trains a day. For the state of Mississippi, it's $240 million a year positive impact after a one-time investment of less than $20 million in support of a Chrissy grant for implementation of infrastructure there. Louisiana has also invested, as well as the city of Mobile. In all 3 forms of government, we need a strong federal partner. So we created the Chrissy Grant Program, Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Initiative Program. In a year, Congress said no new programs, which is why it's called Consolidated Rail Infrastructure. And the Restoration Enhancement Grant to provide that operating support so you can build up the revenue and the brand name. Strong federal partner providing those opportunities to compete for funds and make your case for investment in what will be freight rail infrastructure in most cases. The state then is a partner in supporting financially both the implementation of infrastructure and the revenue support, and they must work across state lines. So that's why you need a commission. We developed the language for the interstate rail commissions to be authorized in order to do that. And then local governments have a role to play as well. That station you see behind me is a commitment by the city of Meridian when they built that, when we built it. So a city will be all behind building an interchange on the interstate because we talk about, oh, look at the economic development that will come. Well, that station is an interchange on an interstate of steel that has a passenger train on it. And that station has returned $197 for every $1 the city put into that structure. Mm-hmm. So there you make a case to the people on return on investment at the local, state, and federal level, and then the impact to their daily lives and quality of life. And I think you've got a winning formula.
You really do. And the mobility, too, is important in rural communities. Just having a means to get places is important.
And you know, Tom talked about, I want to get him back in the conversation because Tom talked about, we all assume in the United States, everybody's got a high-speed train when they don't. And yes, maybe those high-speed trains are designed and crafted one-offs each time you do them. But all of those other governments are also supported by conventional rail. The conventional rail feeds into the higher speed rail. And what would happen in this country, Tom, they don't have to go 200 miles an hour. What if a passenger train, if their average speed beat the automobile? That's what you need to do in this country. At least start beating the automobile. You're clocking at 75 miles an hour average running speed. We don't have enough equipment to put the people on the train that would use that instead of a 35, 40 mile an hour speed.
Well, and that's been the point that I've been pounding on with the Cascades, is that right now, as crappy as our service is, it's faster than air between Seattle and Portland. If you count the whole thing, the air people say, well, it's only 85 minutes wheels up. Well, yeah, but you got to use wheels to get to the airport and get out of the airport, go through the metal detector and on and on and on and on. One of the things that ties all of the conversation together, and it's really important, is that Amtrak sure looks like they have the mission of ignoring the long distance trains, and they do work real hard at promoting the state services. Well, let's see. Amtrak is the default contract operator. They get paid. They don't use any of their money. They're the default equipment owner. They get paid. They don't use any of their money. They get paid for the management. That's why they love the commuter services, because they don't use any of their money. They get paid. And the Amtrak monopoly is just as bad as the freight railroad monopoly, actually. And we talked about that earlier. We need open access passenger service where Amtrak is not the default equipment owner and default contract operator, so that maybe they will quit this charade of downgrading as much as they can get away with the long distance trains and promoting the trains that they get paid to run.
Well, that leads back to solving the liability.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The indemnification
exactly.
is the attraction there. That's why the states depend on Amtrak.
Well, and that brings us back to this equipment pool thing too, because I don't want to be buying trains for private corporations. I don't want to pay for Brightline's trains, but I wouldn't mind if Brightline wanted to rent trains from us. And let's be clear, Brightline in Florida is not a high-speed rail. It's 110, 120, maybe 125 miles an hour. So, in Washington State, we did successfully, we haven't gotten the governor's signature, but my understanding is that if he doesn't sign, it goes into law anyway. We got a bill passed pushing for a higher standard of service by the Amtrak Cascades. When we come around to this next session, our challenge is going to be trying to figure out, how do we pay for the investments that we want, which what we really want is we want dedicated passenger track. And we want a new master agreement with BNSF to share the corridor, to build out what Tom had originally designed, a system that basically has 200 miles of dedicated passenger track between Portland and Vancouver, BC. We want it to have a high 88% on-time performance. We want 14 trains a day between Seattle and Portland and 5 trains a day between Seattle and Vancouver, BC. And we want that. We've got a challenge, though, because they're going to say, oh, this is money. You're just going to keep asking us for money. Well, yeah, we need a source of funding. So we're trying to figure out what's the next steps on that. And whether it's that we take an Oregon type strategy, or we try to, I don't know if we can get to any of the gas tax money like you do in Virginia, because that's already going to the Climate Commitment Act, I believe is there. But another idea came up in the meetings that we had with various leaders, was the idea of setting up special tax districts, which reminds me of what you were saying, John Robert, about folks willing to be pitching in. Like if we could set up special tax districts along the corridor and have temporary taxes that are going to be delivering those goals that people agree that they want to pay for, is that how we go forward?
That's sort of a traditional way that commuter systems are often paid for, is special tax district. And they'll add 2 cents to the fuel tax, for example, per gallon. They'll create an authority, a special authority, and they'll have taxing authority as well. And then that pays for basically an urban commuter system. That's often the way they work.
I'm trying to understand also the balance between these interstate rail commissions and if they have a role in this, or if it's all comes from the states.
So the interstate rail commissions, the fact that we've got 3 states and they're appointed by the governors, but once appointed, they act independently. So a 3-state commission, you have an election that doesn't go your way in a state and there's a governor that's not supportive, or a DOT secretary that's not supportive. You can weather that period of time because you've got 3 states sharing the burden. The commission has been very good about they all support whatever the rail development it is. It may be all in the state of Louisiana, but it supports rail in the region. Then the commission, Mississippi and Alabama commissioners are equally supportive of it. The law allows for 10 commissions. If every commission has 3 states, some will have 2, has to be at least 2. Some will have 4 or 5, but if it averages 3 and there are 10, all of a sudden you've got 60 senators who are buying into the success.
That's a memorable number.
With 60 senators, you can do business.
Right. And so it seems to me, am I missing something, or is this an underutilized tool? How many commissions? You said the
state commission.
How many state commissions or how many interstate commissions are there? You said that there's
not awarded the 10. I think there are only 3, maybe 4 commissions out of the possible 10 that have been awarded.
That's an interesting area of work to be undertaken, isn't it?
Well, the states have to come together and ask to be identified as a commission. So you have to get 2 or more states that come together and say to FRA, we want to be designated a commission. And we have the empowering language by the state legislature. We have sign off from the governor. He's agreed to appoint the commissioners. And with that, FRA will bless your commission. Then it is possible, once created, additional states can join as long as they're contiguous. So for the Southern Rail Commission, we could pick Texas, we could pick up Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida. Florida has been very interested in joining the commission. So has Texas. Georgia's even explored that. None of the 3 states have taken action on that yet, but that's how you grow these commissions. And when you look at them, the vision of passenger rail doesn't stop at the state line any more than a vision for a highway system stops at the state line. Yeah, there is a federal role for providing a vision of connected passenger rail.
The only kink in interstate commissions or multiple jurisdictional commissions is when one of them, a key one, balks and isn't cooperating. As you know, Mobile became a real sticking point for a long time and really held up the Southern Rail Commission in reestablishing that route. At least that's the way I understand it. It happened, and it was the Mobile Port Authority or something that was really balking.
Well, and of course, that's because the Port Authority became convinced by the freight railroad that addition of 2 passenger trains a day would shut down all freight movement along the Gulf. That's nonsense. You terrorize people enough, they begin to believe it. Until the Chrissy grant was awarded its $240 million of investment in the infrastructure of Norfolk Southern, CSX, and the Port of Mobile, all of whom have match money in the Chrissy. So when there's money on the table, all of a sudden you find a way, we can do 2 trains a day and it won't shut down freight on the Gulf.
All right. Well, in terms of getting us all to bed or to dinner, all the things that we all need to do and we all deserve to do, because we got another big day tomorrow, I'm sure. I'd just like everybody to take a turn going around and share, what's your source, what's your seed of hope and inspiration? What do you want to see from rail advocates and folks around in the grassroots? What's the source of hope right now?
That's really a broad question. When I speak with other groups, I tell them that the reason Virginia is where it is today in terms of development of our passenger rail, our $4 billion Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative, is because we've had 30 years of experience in rail policy development in the state. And I think as far as advocacy goes, that's really what I've been doing for many years. But I've also been president of the Virginia Rail Policy Institute for 15, now I'm going on 16 years. And our role has been to complement the advocacy efforts of Virginians for high-speed rail with equally intense policy work in the state, so that we've been working for 30 years, literally, to develop rail policy initiatives in the state. And that began with Mark Warner's governorship and the first dedicated fund for rail infrastructure capital projects that the state put into the state code. And that developed into a passenger rail operating and capital fund as the next step. And then there was the next step and the next in policy development in law in Virginia. And it all culminated in 2019 when we launched an initiative that will literally double the amount of passenger rail service and do almost 100% increase in our commuter rail service on the I-95 corridor and increase frequencies on other routes in the state-supported routes, that is, as well. And it also initiated at the same time a passenger rail authority, which manages all of our passenger rail operations now, as well as construction of new projects, and a Commonwealth Rail Fund. And Tom, I saw you shaking your head when you said fuel taxes will never be used for rail, but in point of fact, that's what's happening now in Virginia.
Constitution in Washington.
Okay, maybe not, but I have hope for every state that with enough development of rail policy, and you have to push just as hard for these policy developments as you do for new routes and new services. And I don't think most of our organizations around the country who are working towards those goals of more routes and services understand the role that rail policy plays. If you don't have that government infrastructure, if you don't have those laws that are enabling laws, and if you don't have the funding mechanisms in place, you're going to have a very hard time, at least with your state-supported services, and achieving the things that you're aspiring to. So I think my hope is that more people who are advocating and who have as goals more routes and services understand the critical role that policy plays within states. And I think that is happening, actually. I know that state legislatures now are starting to introduce more policy legislation that would establish, for example, a separate Department of Rail from their DOT, which is a very critical rail policy. And so I think my hope is that more states will develop more enlightened rail policies, and we have to help them do that. I think more advocates are coming to understand that.
You make me want to have a boot camp for rail policy.
Very good idea.
And a database, a clearinghouse for rail-related legislation to be shared across state advocates. Because why are we all recreating the wheel in these places? I did notice that Texas had a long train limiting bill in its legislative session that had the same 8,500 feet that we had in Washington state. So maybe that something exists, but if it doesn't exist, maybe we could collaborate to help it come into it.
Every state is different, of course, and your base of laws is different, so that some states can't do things constitutionally. For example, Virginia, in its constitution, is unable to own any rail asset or rail infrastructure. It's literally in the Constitution that the state can only own park and roads. So we had to create a rail authority that had the independent power to own rail assets if we were going to move forward with the program. And every state's different in these respects. So there's going to be a lot of variation in what states can do, but there's some basic principle, I think, that you could still promote that would apply to most states. And I think that's a wonderful idea. I'd like to see more of that. Right now, we're in such silos. We plan only for highways. Very few states actually have planning bodies that do rail planning independently of their DOTs. And I think that is a big limiting factor. We do so many consulting studies of how you relieve congestion, and how do you add lanes, and You add signals here and traffic controls there, and it never really solves congestion. You ought to be doing those studies for rail. What can rail solve? If you have a congestion problem, compare what a road improvement and a rail improvement can do with the same segment of road and the same highway. But we don't do that. We don't invest in those kinds of planning structures in most places, and certainly not at the federal level. We all work in our silos. So that's also a policy issue, but I think that would be something, that would be my hope anyway. That would be the next step for me, is how we can promote rail through better planning and more integrated planning and more rail policy awareness.
So any advocate for passenger rail, and certainly everyone on this call tonight, I assume, fills that role, you've got to play the long game.
That's exactly right. That's the term I use. You've got to play the long game.
We've been working 17 years
Right.
on restoring service along the Gulf. It has been intentional. We had to create federal policy to implement and solve the needs of just that service along the Gulf. Now, because it's federal policy, we had to create it in a world that anyone could use. It couldn't be purely parochial, but you've got to be in it for the long haul. And for me, what is my hope? It is this, and very simply, I have 4 grandsons, and I want them to grow up and become adults in a better connected, healthier connected United States than we live in today. We have to begin that work, and we will probably not see it fulfilled in our lifetime.
Definitely not.
But we have to find that future point that is important to us, that's usually in the life of someone small, that we care about what their life is when they're big. And I think as much as we talk about passenger rail, if we get taken too much into the weeds of ties and rail and not make it about connecting human beings to education, to healthcare, to opportunity, to families in a healthier way, then we miss the strongest selling point for any kind of infrastructure development.
That's right.
Nicely said.
Well said.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tom, any final words as we exit?
Well, the first one is one train a day is not service, it's a train.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about education is that right now we have, well, in Washington State, the rail nuts are, a handful. Throughout the country, it's a couple of handfuls. And part of the mission for Climate Rail Alliance, one of the reasons we put it together, is education, not the education for how to build and run a railroad, although I've written 3 textbooks on that, but also on convincing the public what railroads do, why it's important to them, the whole policy thing. I've done 2 books on that, so that they actually go to the legislators. It's not just us train nuts going around asking for money for projects they don't understand. We need to educate the legislators, because right now the legislators learn everything that they know from the people who are supposed to be their transportation experts, which is the highway department, and the Class 1 railroads, who, because they're lazy, in their best interest, they don't want any passenger trains at all. So our mission has been to educate the public to what rail transportation is and why, and to try to educate the lawmakers in what it can do, how it can do it, and why it's important.
Right on. Well, we just went over 17,000 views on the podcast Reconnect America. Just went over 17,000 views. That's of all of the episodes. So I'm hoping that that's helping. Maybe this is one we can pitch into the effort, is to help get the word out and make it so it's not just about the rail nuts or the foamers, et cetera, but it's about all people who care about connecting with their loved ones, connecting with the hospitals, having opportunities in their communities.
Thank you for that. It's been a great series so far.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We're just around, I think, 1,200 or 1,300 in the last few days on the new episode. So we could definitely use everybody's help moving it out to your network. So I really appreciate anything folks do around that. We'd like to keep it up each day instead of it just petering off. So first of all, I just want to express that I feel like, in the bottom of the activist organization, on the t-shirt of the activist organization that hosts Solutionary Rail, the Backbone Campaign, it says, when the people lead, the leaders follow. Now, that may or may not be always true, but I think that somewhat at a certain point, it is true. So let's hopefully we get the people leading on rail, and so the leaders can follow. And mostly, I just want to say thank you to you all for being such a source of inspiration and information and helping us and being great mentors to the rest of us who are out there in the world growing into this advocacy for rail in the public interest. So thank you very much for being on tonight, and thanks for staying on a little bit longer so we could get through this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Glad to have our opportunity.
Been fun.
Awesome. Well, you all are some great people. I'm so glad to see you all in the same place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening in tonight. Feel free to come off mute if you want to say goodnight. I'll stick around for a few minutes. I want to let our guests say goodnight, and thank you very much.
Come south and ride the Mardi Gras from Mobile to New Orleans.
Right, the new name. We didn't get it in the episode because it just got the name, right? The new name is the Mardi Gras
Mardi Gras service. And we'll have beads and doubloons and a special beer brewed for the train.
That is going to be a fun train.